In the late 18th century, the punishment of public whipping in the streets of Glasgow was frequently seen. The magistrates who presided in the borough court had power to sentence people convicted in the city to be confined for any period of time, not exceeding a year. They could also order convicts to be tied to a cart and taken through the streets of the city, then whipped by the hangman. The place where these whippings were inflicted varied, at the discretion of the magistrates, who awarded the degree of punishment in accordance with the enormity of the offence, and took into account the character of the culprit. In more serious cases, the custom was to parade the prisoner down the Gallowgate and Saltmarket, also through the Trongate to the crossing at Glassford and Stockwell Streets, then back again to the Cross and up the High Street to Havana Street. But the usual route was only by the Trongate and High Street, these then being the principal thoroughfares in the city. The criminal had the lash applied opposite the toll booth, Candleriggs and Glassford Streets, also at Bell's Wynd, opposite Blackfriars Church and Havana Street, when the procession returned to lodge the convict back in jail. These exhibitions were fairly uncommon. At noon on Wednesdays, which was market day, the punishment was meted out by Hangy Jock, John Sutherland, the Glasgow Hangman. The crowd which usually gathered to accompany these spectacles wasn't normally very large, amounting to only a few hundred Glasgow citizens. In 1725, Daniel Defoe threatened to publish a graphic account of the deadly riots in Glasgow of June of that year, when a number of rioters were killed, after the authorities called in the military. It was also at this time when the mansion of Daniel, also known as Donald Campbell of Shawfield, the MP for Clyde Boroughs, was internally damaged by the rioters. Windows were smashed, and much of its furnishings and other contents were looted. The reason he was targeted was that he'd supported the tightening of the excise law in Scotland. In Parliament, he'd also voted for a malt tax to be imposed, much to the disdain of ordinary people who enjoyed their beer and whisky. The Provost of Glasgow, Charles Miller, and the city magistrates were later arrested for having supported the mob during the riot, and although the charges were dropped, the town council was fined £10,000 to cover the cost of the damage. Campbell received thousands of pounds in damages, using the money to buy the island of Islay, even though the cost of repair to his home was much less than the large sum he received. At the Circuit Court held in Glasgow on 11th April 1798, only one criminal case was brought before it for trial, that resulted in the death sentence being passed. That was the trial of John Macmillan, who was accused of killing Alexander Moody in 1791. Macmillan was indicted on the crime in the spring of 1792, but had absconded. 6 years later, he was found in London and transferred back to Glasgow to stand trial for the murder. On Friday, 13th April, the jury returned their verdict of guilty, and the judges sentenced him to be hanged at the common place of execution for his crime on 16th May. Groups of men and women escorted Jock Sutherland in his duties during his time as the city's hangman. Those who went about with Hangy were only what was then termed the scum of the population, many of whom were out of work, according to reports. They formed a mass or ring around the site of the punishment and watched as the culprit received his sentence. In the middle of the crowd, a circle was formed around the prisoner, made up of town officials in full dress, armed with staves. Guarded by them was not the convict, who was often seen as only a secondary person to the whole thing, but Hangy Jock, who carried out the punishment to the letter of the law. There he stood, bringing fear and trepidation to the culprit. On some of his public appearances, he didn't come out in full uniform. Perhaps he felt there was no reason, as everyone knew who he was and his role. But even when dressed with all the trappings and terrors of the law on him, he was described as only a miserable and ill-looking wretch of a hangman. He was of average height for the time, but thin and wrinkled, with a small head and a white and wizened face. He had spindly legs, which, when he was in full dress, were adorned in white stockings. He also had buckles to his shoes and at his knees, and his clothes were made of blue cloth, including a long coat, all trimmed with scarlet, and a cocked hat with white edging. At times he showed frills from his wrists, reaching to the knuckles of his skeletal fingers, which wielded the cat-o'-nine-tails, a multi-tailed whip, which caused a great deal of pain on the recipient. Jock's appearance was such that had he lived at the time when Scotland would drown wrinkly old women accused of witchcraft, he may have been burned at the stake as a warlock, due to his looks. In June 1871, a séance was held in London when it was alleged the ghost of Hangy Jock came through to the medium. He said that 60 years ago he was still alive, and he was well known in Glasgow at the time. He went on that when he went to the spirit world, he met those he had duly and legally strangled. They didn't forget hanging. Everyone, he said, hated him, and one day as he sat by the wayside, heartbroken, a missionary came by and took him away with him, then consciously left him. When he woke up, his rags had gone, and he was wearing a grey robe. The kindness led him to tears. He never saw the hanged creatures for a long while. Once his strength returned, he went out on a walk with one of his teachers of the other world and met some of those he'd hanged, who'd also changed for the better in death. He finished by telling the medium his name was John Sutherland, the Glasgow Hangman, and would return to tell them more about his time in the afterlife. Whether he did or not is unknown. As for corporal punishment, it was abolished in Scotland in 1948, and hanging followed in 1969. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.